You worked on the Tomb Raider reboot for many years there. And in the final hours that Jeff Keighley put together, they talked about in that early phase of trying to lock down what the Tomb Raider reboot was, it seemed like it was taking a lot of inspiration from Ico and Shadow of the Colossus, including having like giants wandering the world and Lara would be on a horse. Do you want to just talk about that idea of trying to incorporate some lessons from maybe Team Ico in particular and infuse that into like a reboot of such a big Western brand as Tomb Raider?
Yeah, I think, I was actually recently talking to another ironically interview that the topic was solitude in game design. And it ended up being a pretty cool topic for me to talk about because I'm a big backpacker and stuff, and I love being out in the wilderness by myself. And those games, Ico obviously is this very specific thing with Yorda, but generally they're games that feel very much about solitude, right? About being out on your own in this vast wilderness. And to me, that was a big core of Tomb Raider. And so, yes, I and am I obsessed with those games and still am? Yes. And as many of us are, right? But it felt like to me at the time, there were a lot of correlations there that would make sense for Tomb Raider, right? If we were going to look at Tomb Raider through a new lens and reboot it, then let's push in these directions. And, being out on the plains with, in Shadow of the Colossus, feeling like you're exploring these ancient places and finding these old temples and having these larger than life, experiences with the bosses and stuff, felt very Tomb Raider at the time. So I feel like it wasn't that much of a stretch for me to get there. And yes, I'm a fanboy about it anyway, so I can see that probably where it's coming from. I don't remember if this was in final hours or not, but and I don't think this is too much of a spoiler or reveal, but it probably was in that. But there was a time actually where we also had a companion character too, that Lara was going to have, coming around. And you'd have to protect and stuff in a Yorda kind of way. That was pre-horse. So we were dabbling with a lot of different things. That was the challenge of rebooting, right? It's like you can go in any direction almost. So how do you find that direction, right? And so we ended up on sort of the survival action side of it, which ended up being the core. But you have to explore. You have to find some different inspirations.
You have to explore to see if exploring is going to be the core.
Yeah, right. You have to explore to explore.
Okay, so the companion thing went from horse to the Izumi, like the little girl that controls water. That was...
Yes.
Okay. Yep, and then there was a monkey in there as well at some point.
Oh, the monkey. I don't remember the monkey. Was that in final?
In final hours, they said there was a monkey, but who knows if that was just one person's perspective.
I don't remember the monkey. It could have been. It could have been. My memory's terrible anyway, but yeah.
So what is that like to be within a big company like Crystal? And not that you're the lone champion for saying, let's look to Team Ico, but what is it like to try and infuse more of that artistic, subdued loneliness into a AAA production versus the needs of a company to actually stay afloat?
Well, I mean, it's very challenging, for sure, especially with, arguably one of, at the time, IDOS and then Square's one of their bigger franchises, at least Western franchises of Tomb Raider, and you're rebooting. So yeah, I mean, as you can see from the final product, I think ultimately what did win out was something that was a little more marketable and more sort of mainstream, if you will. And so, and I think lessons learned for me, especially in that pre-production process, were making sure that I don't dig my heels in at the wrong times on the wrong things. Because I think that there's good reasons why we didn't go in those directions that I wanted to when it comes to being influenced by Team Ico. So, and so it's heartbreaking to change direction sometimes on that stuff, but you would like to think that oftentimes it's for good reason too. So yeah, I mean, I can't say anything other than it's just difficult to go through that process because you're trying to convince people, right? Like creative direction, especially because you're even, on big teams, you're even less hands-on. So a lot of your time is spent negotiating and being a diplomat and convincing and pitching, and kind of, it's a lot about that, that sort of that relationship with the team of trying to convince them of the vision that you're going after, right, and why it's right and why it's going to work. But then also knowing, as I'm sure a lot of your guests have talked about, knowing when to kill your darlings and knowing when, okay, this isn't working. Izumi's not going to work. And in the horse's case, my vague memory of that is like to some degree, there's also scoping that has to happen. Like a horse is a big deal. You can make a whole game about a horse. As you could sort of say, Shadow of the Colossus was a big part of that. And then it diverts away from Lara. So in that case, that was a good direction to shift away from. It's very challenging, especially when you're trying to do something new, and I've been fortunate enough and also unlucky enough, I guess, to some degree, to have that happen to me multiple times in my career where I'm taking a franchise and having to try to do new things with it. And it's terrifying. It's a terrifying process because there's a lot of opinion about what it should not, what should change and what should not change. As you can imagine, would say Halo. And so, going through that process is just can be really rough. But it can be rewarding if you get through it.
With the Tomb Raider example, I just keep thinking, you talk about, seeing that maybe having the giants and the horse and all that stuff might have been too far. Maybe this is just the disconnect between, Games Press or, Games Press on Twitter specifically versus the wider public. But I think if you were to pitch a Tomb Raider reboot happening right now that was inspired by Shadow of the Colossus meets Silent Hill, which would seem like what the pitch was back then, I feel like everybody would say, yes, that sounds awesome. What is that disconnect? Is it the changing times, or is it the disconnect between who's buying this game at Walmart versus who's talking about it on Twitter?
Well, I don't want to be too cynical about it, but I think you are onto something when it comes to, because I think developers and journalists tend to be pretty similar on sort of a starting page. We're reading from the same book, but I do think that there is wisdom. That's another sort of lesson learned for myself over the years, is really understanding. And I don't want to be reductive about it, talking about it as a marketing thing, because I really respect marketing, and good marketing is a really valuable, awesome thing. But there is something to be said about knowing the audience and knowing how to go after them and what the right amount of Silent Hill and Shadow of Colossus is, but not too much of those two things, And so, because there's the old, whatever Ford quote is, they don't, if they would have asked, I would have built a faster horse, blah, 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 which apparently I found out later, he wasn't the one that quoted that.
Right.
But anyway, so we actually use that quote a lot because everyone comes at you saying the audience isn't going to want this, it's like, well, how do you know that? Mm-hmm. So there's that constant debate, but I do think you can go too far. And I think to your point, I know you're being, using the Walmart example is also reductive, but there is some wisdom to that Tomb Raider specifically is a big franchise. You don't want to push too many people away with being too artsy with it. Mm-hmm. And we love those games. I think Shadow of the Colossus is right behind you. Is that what I see there?
Oh, yeah. I have a giant painting behind me. So, it's tipping my hand.
So I know who I'm talking to. It's framed and everything. But, is that a breakout blockbuster situation, for Square Enix? Probably not. That's the harsh truth of it. And so for somebody in my role, especially like you said, what I've been doing over the last few projects, I now have to really think about the sort of, I don't want to say the business side of it, but kind of the business side of it.
It's interesting talking about Tomb Raider. I mean, are you happy with how that game eventually ended up? I mean, it's beloved. Looking back on it now, I think that design holds up so well. But the tone you've had is that you wanted so much more, and that it was scaled down to that. But what do you think about that final product?
No, I do. And when I think back, like you mentioned, the Silent Hill meets Shadow of the Colossus, which, I do wish we made that game as well sometimes. But that's like a selfish thing, right? It's like, I wish we made it because I would love it. But what the team ended up doing, and I actually think I wrote a long letter to them after playing it afterwards. Where we ended up going, because the whole thrust of survival action, the survival tone was what I infused. Eventually, that was the word that we kind of rallied behind. That was new to Tomb Raider, right? Not new to games, but it was new to Tomb Raider. And I think they nailed it. They hit it out of the park in that regard. And I think Rise only got better. And so I think, I couldn't have been happier with, because again, the direction changed, like cutting that stuff that we talked about. that's part of the process. That stuff's going to get cut. Every game has their Izumi situation happening in some degree. It might be small, might be large, but to some degree, you need that stuff to be cut so you can find what the end result is going to be. And that's what they did. That's what we did. And so the team found it, and they polished the heck out of that thing. So yeah, I loved it as a fan, as a Tomb Raider fan. I thought it was great.
MinnMax is a Patreon about games, friends, and getting better. The Deepest Dive is the best, most thorough discussions about games on the internet. Prove us wrong, please. The MinnMax Show podcast airs every Thursday. Patreon supporters vote on what we stream every single week, and a whole lot more. Give us a shot, try subscribing to the YouTube channel, and we hope we can win you over.